I need to start this specific video by telling you plainly what didn't actually happen, because the headline circulating right now claims Iran's parliament formally admitted the war is lost, and that specific exact claim is false. No such declaration exists. What actually happened is, in some ways, a more revealing and more useful story than the fabricated version. A genuine, documented pattern of internal fracture inside Iran's own government, senior officials publicly contradicting each other, a parliament that spent large stretches of this war literally shut down, and on the record admissions about economic damage that Iranian state media itself has reported. I want to walk through what's actually confirmed here because I think the real story is more interesting than the clickbait version, and because presenting a fabricated quote as fact is exactly the kind of thing that gets channels removed and audiences misled. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, years flying commercial airliners since. Before I go any further, I want to be direct about something. I searched specifically for any parliamentary statement, resolution, or official admission matching the claim in that headline and found nothing that supports it. What I did find is a genuinely substantial body of reporting on internal Iranian political dysfunction throughout this war, and that's what this video is actually going to cover. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from named, checkable sources, direct quotes from Iranian officials reported by state-linked outlets, wire reporting on the Majlis's operational status, and opposition-sourced compilations that I'll flag explicitly wherever they appear, rather than blending every source into one undifferentiated wall of claims. Before getting into the specific timeline, it's worth understanding what this institution actually is and why its shutdown carries real weight, rather than assuming every reader already knows Iran's governmental structure in detail. The Majlis, formerly the Islamic Consultative Assembly, consists of 290 members elected for 4-year terms, and while Iran's actual centers of power still lie primarily with the supreme leader, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and various unelected oversight institutions layered on top of the elected government, the Majlis nonetheless plays a highly visible role in legitimizing state policy, managing public anger during moments of crisis, and shaping Iran's formal negotiating position with Western powers. It's increasingly functioned less like a conventional legislature in the way that term is typically understood, and more like what's been described as a strategic security institution in its own right, framing economic resistance as a form of national defense and linking its own parliamentary decisions directly to broader military deterrence. Understanding that hybrid function matters for evaluating just how significant it is that this specific institution, one that's spent recent years increasingly positioning itself as central to Iran's wartime legitimacy, has nonetheless been the target of repeated shutdowns during exactly the periods when the country has faced its most serious external military pressure. Let's start with the parliament itself, because its actual status throughout this war is a story on its own, and it's considerably stranger than most coverage acknowledges. According to reporting on Iran's Islamic Consultative Assembly, known as the Majlis, the body has been effectively shut down for extended stretches since this war began on February 28th. A national security commissioner within the parliament, identified in reporting as Nabavian, went so far as to describe what was happening as a coup d'etat, an extraordinary characterization to hear from inside the very institution being described. According to that same reporting, the Majlis was reportedly planned to reopen following the state funeral held for Iran's assassinated supreme leader after July 9th, and one member of parliament stated directly that the body had been kept shut specifically to prevent it from interfering with the memorandum of understanding being negotiated with the United States. When the Majlis did eventually reopen, holding its first session at night, members reportedly voted to formally end that same U.S.-Iran memorandum and called for retaliation over their assassinated leader. Quick question before we go any further into this, and I genuinely want you to sit with it rather than just skip straight past it. If a government shuts down its own elected legislature specifically to prevent representatives from weighing in on a major diplomatic agreement, what does that actually tell you about how much genuine internal debate that government actually tolerates, even during a moment of severe national crisis, when you might expect broader input to matter more, not less? Drop your honest read on that down in the comments, because I think it's genuinely a more revealing detail about Iran's actual internal governance right now than any single quote, real or fabricated, could ever be on its own. Now, let's talk about what actually has been said publicly by Iranian officials, because there's a real substantial pattern of internal criticism here, just not the pattern the clickbait headline describes. In late April, deepening internal divisions within Iran's ruling establishment came into sharp public focus, with officials, lawmakers, clerics, and state media openly clashing over war strategy and the question of negotiating with the United States at all. Hardline cleric and member of parliament Hamid Rasai told a parliamentary session directly, "If we sign this ceasefire, rest assured they will launch a war again this autumn." That's a genuinely striking thing for a sitting lawmaker to say publicly about his own government's negotiating strategy, effectively predicting his own side's diplomacy would fail before it had even concluded. Fellow hardliner MP Malik Shariati took an even more aggressive public tone the same day, claiming Iran had sent what he described as stern warnings to its adversaries. We have sent firm messages through various channels that this time our new cards will be such that you will have to say goodbye to the region's oil and gas for a long time. You will have to say goodbye to the region's infrastructure. Shariati also insisted the war's damage to Iran had actually been less severe than the damage caused by sanctions, and called for reparations to the last real, citing orders from the supreme leader to seize or inflict equivalent losses on Iran's adversaries. That specific rhetoric, hardline lawmakers publicly threatening more aggressive escalation rather than expressing any resignation or defeat, is worth sitting with, because it's the near opposite of what the clickbait headline claims. If anything, the documented public statements from Iran's parliament throughout this war lean toward defiant escalation rhetoric, considerably more often than anything resembling concession or admission of defeat. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf stated flatly back in March on social media, "We will never seek a ceasefire. We firmly believe that the aggressor must be dealt a heavy blow so that he will learn his lesson and never dare to entertain the idea of invading Iran again." That's about as far from an admission of defeat as a public statement can get. Ghalibaf has continued in that same defiant register throughout this war, separately claiming during a live interview that actual Israeli casualties from the earlier 12-day war were significantly higher than officially reported, citing what he described as scientific models suggesting the reported figure of 3,500 injuries should imply at least 500 deaths, and asserting that Iran had contended not just with Israel, but with what he characterized as NATO and Western powers operating under American command. Whatever you make of the accuracy of that specific casualty claim, which I haven't independently verified and would treat with real caution, given it comes from Iran's own parliament speaker, with an obvious interest in overstating enemy losses, the rhetorical posture behind it, projecting strength and inflicting damage rather than conceding weakness, runs consistently through virtually every public statement attributed to Iran's parliamentary leadership across this entire war. Second thing I want you to actually do right now, not just read past and keep scrolling. If you're genuinely surprised by how much public infighting and contradictory messaging has actually come out of Iran's own government throughout this war, comment the word infighting down below. So I know that's a story worth digging into even further in a future video, because I think it's genuinely underreported relative to how revealing it actually is about the real internal pressures Iran's leadership is currently facing, well beyond just the single headline this video set out to correct. Let's talk about the economic admissions, because this is actually where the real, substantive story sits, even though it's considerably less dramatic than a fabricated defeat declaration. Iranian regime economist Hossein Ragfar admitted directly on state media that inflation currently affecting the country is domestically driven rather than purely a product of external sanctions or war damage. He specifically told state media, after the 12-day war, the currency price dropped from 93,000 to 83,000 tomans, but after the war, they constantly raised the currency price up to 120,000 tomans. Ragfar directly linked that currency devaluation to rising costs of basic goods, cooking oil, eggs, meat, and other essentials that ordinary Iranian families depend on daily. Separately, the spokesman for Iran's own Dairy Industry Association announced that prices would rise 20% starting in June, after the cost of raw milk had already increased 29%, and confirmed that removal of a preferential currency exchange rate had resulted in an estimated 15% reduction in consumption of dairy products, specifically, meaning ordinary Iranians are documented by Iran's own industry spokespeople as buying measurably less food because of the economic conditions this war has produced. There's additional reporting worth mentioning from Iran's own state press, specifically documenting rising public frustration connected to these economic conditions. State newspaper Jahan Sanat reported a surge in what was described as public complaints and grievances related to the deteriorating economic situation, a genuinely notable thing for a state-affiliated outlet to report on at all, since acknowledging rising public frustration inherently means acknowledging that frustration exists in the first place, rather than simply staying silent on the topic entirely. Combined with the dairy and inflation admissions, this establishes a consistent pattern across multiple, separate state-affiliated Iranian sources, all independently documenting real economic strain on ordinary Iranian households, without any single one of them needing to claim, falsely, that this economic pressure amounts to a formal admission of military defeat. The economic story stands on its own, verified through Iran's own state channels, and doesn't require any exaggeration to be genuinely significant. That's a genuinely significant admission, coming directly from within Iran's own state apparatus, not from Western intelligence assessments or opposition sources. When a country's own regime, economist, and industry spokespeople are publicly confirming double-digit consumption declines in basic food categories, that's a real, documented economic strain, expressed through Iran's own official channels, rather than through any adversarial framing imposed from outside. I think that's worth taking seriously, precisely because it didn't need to be exaggerated or fabricated to be a genuinely alarming data point about the war's domestic toll. Though notably, it's still framed as a warning against future collapse rather than any admission that collapse or defeat had already occurred. That distinction, warning against a future risk versus confirming a present reality, is precisely the line the fabricated headline erases entirely. And I think it's genuinely the most important single distinction in this entire video. A president telling his own people to stay unified so that division doesn't become their downfall is a fundamentally different statement in both substance and political function than a parliament formally declaring the war already lost. One is a leader trying to actively prevent a bad outcome he clearly fears is possible. The other would be an institution formally conceding that the bad outcome had already happened. Iran's actual public record, across every source I've reviewed for this video, contains real, extensive evidence of the first kind of statement, and no verifiable evidence at all of the second. Let's talk about the president's own public statements, because they add another layer to this picture of internal strain, expressed carefully but unmistakably. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a television address, warned specifically of the risk of internal collapse, saying, "They cannot conquer a country with missiles and bombs and planes, but with division, breaking, and fighting they can. We must try so that this unity, cohesion, and empathy does not break." Read carefully, that's a president publicly acknowledging to his own population that internal division represents a greater existential threat to Iran than the actual foreign military campaign being waged against it. That's a remarkable thing for a sitting head of government to say out loud during an active war. And it's about as close as anything in the confirmed record comes to an official acknowledgement of serious internal strain. Though notably, it's still framed as a warning against future collapse rather than any admission that collapse or defeat had already occurred. Separately, senior regime figure Mohammad Javad Larijani sharply criticized the government's own handling of the crisis on state television, saying pointedly, "I am sorry that in the government apparatus, only the vice president speaks clearly about the Strait of Hormuz. We have not heard even one word from the respected president." That's a senior figure within Iran's own political establishment publicly criticizing his own president's communication strategy during an active war, broadcast on Iran's own state television. Larijani went further, calling for suspending Iran's commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and accelerating parliamentary action, specifically on management of the Strait of Hormuz. I want to flag something about sourcing here directly, because I think it matters for how you weigh everything I've just walked through. A meaningful portion of the specific quotes I've cited come through reporting from the National Council of Resistance of Iran, an organized opposition group with an explicit, long-standing political interest in portraying the Iranian regime as fractured and weakening. That doesn't mean the quotes themselves are fabricated. Quotes attributed to specific named officials delivered on state media or in parliamentary sessions are generally verifiable events that either happened or didn't, but it does mean the selection and framing of which quotes get highlighted, and the narrative arc built around them comes from a source with a clear stake in emphasizing division and weakness specifically. I think it's more honest to flag that directly than to present opposition-sourced compilation reporting with the same neutral framing as, say, a direct CENTCOM statement or an IAEA assessment. This is exactly the kind of distinction I try to apply consistently across every video on this channel. Regardless of which side of a given conflict a source happens to favor, an opposition group's compilation of real quotes deserves a different evidentiary weighting than an official government statement or an independent international body's assessment, even when every individual quote in that compilation turns out to be accurately attributed and genuinely verifiable on its own terms. Let's talk about another documented episode from this same period, because it's genuinely one of the clearer, most concrete pieces of evidence for internal dysfunction inside Iran's parliament. It doesn't rely on any interpretation or opposition framing at all. It's simply a matter of contested public numbers. On April 29th, state-linked Iranian outlet Fararu reported a significant discrepancy involving support for the negotiating team and Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf. Official claims had initially boasted that 256 members of Parliament had signed a statement backing the negotiation team's approach. Member of Parliament Hossein Samsami publicly corrected that claim the same day, stating that only 116 signatures had actually been collected by 9 in the morning, a discrepancy of 140 signatures between the official claim and the verified count. Samsami himself refused to sign the statement at all, citing what he described as reservations with its specific text. That's a genuinely remarkable data point. An Iranian state-linked outlet itself publicly contradicting an inflated official claim about parliamentary support for the government's own negotiating position, correcting the record downward by well over half the originally claimed number. If you're looking for hard evidence of real institutional strain inside Iran's government, a state media outlet publicly catching its own parliament in an inflated support claim is about as concrete as this kind of story gets. Considerably more concrete than any single dramatic quote, real or fabricated. Let's talk about the more recent parliamentary developments too, because there's actually a genuinely newsworthy update from just this past week that connects directly to this story, even though it's considerably more measured than the clickbait framing suggests. On July 18th, a presiding board member of Iran's parliament, identified as Mojtaba Yousefi, called for Iran's immediate withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As of the most recent tracking available, that call had not advanced to formal parliamentary action, meaning it remains a statement from an individual official rather than an enacted policy position of the parliament as a body. That's worth understanding precisely because it illustrates the actual texture of how Iran's parliament has been functioning throughout this war. Individual members and officials making forceful, sometimes contradictory public statements, without those statements necessarily translating into unified, binding institutional action, which is a genuinely different and more chaotic picture than either Parliament admits defeat or a unified, disciplined wartime government functioning smoothly. There's another documented statement worth walking through here too, because it shows just how far the hardline faction's public rhetoric extended, even while the government was actively negotiating a ceasefire. Former Iranian Foreign Minister Manouchehr Mottaki proposed aggressive escalation, specifically if the conflict resumed after any ceasefire, stating plainly, "With the first shot by the Americans, we must immediately start a ground war." Think about what it means for a former foreign minister, someone who at one point represented Iran's diplomatic voice to the entire world, to be publicly advocating for immediate ground war as the correct response to any future American strike, while his own government was simultaneously trying to negotiate a lasting ceasefire agreement. That's not the voice of a government coalescing around a single unified strategy. That's a government where former senior officials feel free to publicly stake out positions directly at odds with whatever the active diplomatic track happens to be pursuing at that exact moment. It's also worth remembering that this specific pattern, Parliament shutting down during active conflict, had already happened once before this current war even began, which suggests it's less an emergency, one-time response to this specific crisis, and more an established institutional habit Iran's government reaches for whenever conflict escalates. Iran's parliament was also shut during the earlier 12-day war in June of last year. At the time, several members of parliament criticized that earlier shutdown decision publicly, although sessions did eventually resume once a ceasefire took hold in that specific, shorter conflict. Anti-negotiation members of parliament have specifically stated, regarding the more recent shutdown during this current war, that the closure was designed specifically to stop them from interfering with the government's negotiating strategy. One member, Rasaye, described asking the Supreme National Security Council directly for the specific resolution supposedly authorizing that shutdown, only to be told by several SNSC members that no such resolution actually existed, and that when the parliamentary presidium was asked to produce that resolution, they provided nothing at all. That's a genuinely striking detail. Elected members of Iran's own parliament being unable to obtain confirmation that a legal basis for shutting down their own institution even existed in the first place. A level of procedural opacity that goes well beyond ordinary wartime secrecy into something closer to the kind of institutional dysfunction that erodes a government's own internal legitimacy over time. Let's also address the broader diplomatic collapse this internal fracture sits inside of, because it provides useful context for why tensions inside Iran's government have been running this high. Despite the memorandum of understanding reached back in June, one specifically intended to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and formally end this war, Iran continued asserting what's been described as hegemonic control over the strait, repeatedly threatening and attacking commercial ships in an apparent effort to coerce the international community into accepting Iranian set protocols and fees for passage. That behavior directly provoked renewed American strikes, particularly following attacks on 3 ships in early July, and by July 7th, President Trump stated publicly that he considered the truce over entirely. That's the actual backdrop against which all of this internal Iranian political fracturing has been playing out. A genuinely failed diplomatic effort, followed by renewed and escalating military conflict, which is exactly the kind of pressure that tends to expose and intensify pre-existing internal political divisions in any government, authoritarian or otherwise. There's a genuinely useful historical pattern worth bringing in here too, because Iran's situation right now isn't the first time a government under this kind of combined military and internal political pressure has had to navigate exactly this dilemma. Authoritarian and hybrid governments facing simultaneous external military pressure and internal factional competition have historically shown a documented tendency to lean toward external confrontation rather than negotiated concession, precisely because a visible external enemy gives competing internal factions a shared, unifying target that can temporarily paper over their disagreements with each other. A negotiated settlement, by contrast, requires some faction within the government to visibly own the concessions involved, which creates an immediate, identifiable political target for hardliner rivals within that same government to attack. That dynamic helps explain something that might otherwise seem contradictory in everything we've covered in this video. A government experiencing genuine documented internal strain simultaneously producing some of its most defiant escalatory public rhetoric. Internal weakness and external belligerence aren't actually opposites in a situation like this. They can be mutually reinforcing, precisely because appearing weak toward an external adversary is often more politically dangerous for any individual official's own survival within that government than the underlying strain itself. I want to spend a moment on why a story like this, real internal fracture without a fabricated headline claim, actually matters more for understanding this war's trajectory than a fake defeat announcement would. A single dramatic quote, even a fabricated one, gives you a clean, satisfying narrative beat, but it doesn't actually tell you anything useful about how a government under this kind of sustained pressure is likely to behave going forward. The real picture: hardline lawmakers publicly predicting their own government's negotiations will fail, a president warning his own population that internal division is more dangerous than foreign bombs, senior officials publicly criticizing each other on state television, a parliament repeatedly shut down and reopened depending on whether the ruling establishment wants elected officials weighing in on a given diplomatic moment, is a far more useful picture for understanding what kind of decisions this government is actually capable of making right now. A government experiencing genuine internal fracture doesn't necessarily move toward surrender. Sometimes fractured governments move toward exactly the kind of unpredictable escalation we've discussed in other videos on this channel, because internal factions competing for legitimacy sometimes find hardline defiance more politically survivable than the appearance of concession, especially when hardliners within the same government are publicly, repeatedly signaling they view any negotiated settlement as a betrayal waiting to happen. Let's talk about what this pattern suggests for how seriously to weigh future headlines making similarly dramatic claims about Iran's internal political state, because I think that's genuinely the most useful, transferable lesson from this specific video. Headlines claiming a government has admitted total defeat, especially phrased with maximum dramatic framing like "the unthinkable happened," should trigger real skepticism by default, not because governments never experience genuine internal collapse. They absolutely can and sometimes do, but because that specific kind of unambiguous, total admission is rare, and the incentive to fabricate or dramatically overstate a much messier, more ambiguous reality is extremely high in a media environment that rewards maximally dramatic framing, regardless of accuracy. The actual verifiable version of this story, contradictory public statements, a repeatedly shuttered parliament, real economic admissions, genuine but carefully hedged presidential warnings about internal division, is messier, less immediately satisfying, and considerably more useful for actually understanding what's happening inside Iran's government right now than the clean, dramatic, and simply false version circulating under this headline. Let's talk briefly about how a headline like this one likely comes into existence in the first place, because I think understanding that process is useful for spotting similar fabrications going forward in this war and in whatever the next major conflict happens to be. A genuinely accurate, if less dramatic, starting point: real internal Iranian political fracture, documented economic admissions, a parliament with a documented history of shutting down during crises, gets picked up by a channel or outlet optimizing purely for engagement. Somewhere in that process, internal fracture and economic strain quietly becomes "Parliament admits defeat," a transformation that isn't really lying in the sense of inventing facts from nothing. It's closer to taking a real, complicated, multi-sourced situation and compressing it into the single most dramatic possible one-sentence summary, discarding all the nuance and caveats that made the original reporting responsible in the first place. That compression process is genuinely insidious precisely because it doesn't feel like fabrication to the person doing it. It feels like simplification, making a complicated story more accessible. But the end result is functionally identical to fabrication from the audience's perspective, a claim presented as fact that the underlying sourcing simply doesn't support, regardless of how many genuinely real individual facts got compressed together to produce it. I also want to be fair to the underlying instinct behind headlines like this one, even while correcting this specific factual claim, because I don't think everyone sharing or believing this headline is acting in bad faith. There is a real, documented pattern of stress and division inside Iran's government throughout this war, And it's genuinely reasonable for someone encountering fragments of that pattern. A hardliner threatening escalation here, a president warning about internal collapse there, an economist admitting inflation is domestically driven, to conclude something significant and negative is happening to Iran's governing coalition. That underlying instinct is accurate. The specific claim built on top of it, a formal parliamentary admission that the war is lost, is not, and I think the responsible thing to do is affirm the accurate underlying instinct while correcting the specific fabricated claim, rather than treating the whole thing as equally false or equally true. I want to close by returning to something I said earlier in this video, because I think it's the single most important thing to take away from this specific breakdown. The real story here was never going to fit cleanly into a single dramatic sentence. And I think that's actually true of almost every genuinely significant development in this entire war. Wars end, when they end at all, through exactly this kind of messy, contradictory, multi-front pressure, economic strain admitted quietly on state media, political infighting playing out in parliamentary sessions and television interviews, hardliners and pragmatists pulling a government in opposite directions simultaneously, not through a single, clean, dramatic admission, delivered all at once in a moment anyone could point to afterward and say, that's when it changed. If you're trying to actually understand how this war might eventually resolve, the boring, carefully sourced version of this story is genuinely more useful than the dramatic, false one, even though I fully understand which version is more tempting to click on. Last thing before you go, and I genuinely mean this rather than treating it as an empty formality, if breakdowns like this one, ones that are genuinely willing to directly correct a false headline rather than just quietly repackaging it with slightly different, softer words to avoid the awkwardness of an outright correction, are valuable to you, go ahead and hit that follow button right now. Because I think that specific kind of direct correction is exactly what keeps a channel like this one trustworthy over the long run. Even in moments when it means telling you plainly that a headline you personally clicked on isn't actually accurate. And go back to that earlier question, if you genuinely haven't answered it yet, what a legislature being shut down specifically to prevent it from weighing in on a major diplomatic decision actually tells you about a government's real internal tolerance for dissent, because I think that's a genuinely more revealing, more useful detail than any single fabricated quote could ever be, however dramatic that fabricated quote might sound on its own. Thank you for sitting through the corrected, properly sourced version of this story rather than the dramatic but false version circulating elsewhere. I think being willing to tell you directly when a trending headline is wrong, even when the accurate version is less immediately satisfying, is exactly what earns the kind of trust that makes a channel worth coming back to. And I'd rather build that trust slowly and honestly than chase a single viral claim that doesn't hold up the moment anyone actually checks it. There's a genuine temptation in a media environment that rewards the most dramatic possible framing above almost everything else to just go along with whatever version of a story is already circulating and getting attention, rather than doing the extra work of checking it against actual named sources and finding out it doesn't hold up. I'd rather lose the easy version of the viral moment than build this channel's credibility on claims that fall apart the first time someone actually looks for the source behind them. I'll see you in the next one.